The content of this podcast has not been evaluated by Health Canada or the FDA. It is educational in nature and should not be taken as medical advice. Always consult a qualified medical professional to see if a diet, lifestyle change, or supplement is right for you. Any supplements mentioned are not intended to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease. Please note that the opinions of the guest or host are their own and may not reflect those of Advanced Orthomolecular Research Incorporated. Hello and welcome to Supplementing Health, a podcast presented by Advanced Orthomolecular Research. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Herkel. This show is all about applying evidence-based and effective dietary, lifestyle, and natural health product strategies for your optimal health. We are going to feature some very engaging clinicians and experts from the world of functional and naturopathic medicine to help achieve our mission to empower people to lead their best lives naturally. Welcome to the Supplementing Health Show. My name is Dr. Paul Herkel. I'm your host. I'd like to welcome back my special guests, Dr. Robin Murphy and Dr. Aaron Goldman. This is part 2 of our show all about genetics and the application to our health. Part 1, we really talked about the baseline, understanding what genetics and genomics is, why should we even care about understanding our genetics. We talked a lot about precision and personalized medicine, which is the future of medicine. And that's something that we believe here at AOR. And as clinicians, I think we're definitely seeing that with the speed of technology and how it's advancing. And part 2, what we're going to talk about today, is all about how to apply genetics and the information that you can glean from understanding your lifestyle genetics to your health. And I think this is really where the rubber meets the road. I'm really excited for this episode because it's going to be the meat and potatoes of why you do what you do in practice, Robin, and why we've developed a test like my blueprint. So I'd like to start off by welcoming both back to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Okay, so let's dive right into it because we have a lot to cover. So we're not going to talk about, what genes are. We've talked about in episode 1. So if you've missed that, you guys anybody listening can go back and listen to part 1 and get all about that kind of background information. At this point, we're assuming everyone kind of understands why you'd want to do a genetic test, and hopefully if they haven't done already, they're really intrigued to do it. And now we're going to talk about what's some of the information in certain areas of health that you might learn. So there is many different things that we can learn. So I'll start with you, Aaron, and maybe let's start talking about the specific area of nutrients, because I know you've had in the part 1, you gave me a couple examples of iron and beta carotene. What are some of the other important things that you might learn from a genetic test like my blueprint? And then we'll move to you, Robin, and we'll talk a little bit about food allergies, sensitivities, and gluten, which is a huge topic that everyone's kind of deciding on, should I go gluten-free or not? Mm-hmm. So let's start with you, Aaron, and dive right into that those nutrients.
Sure, yeah. We have, as part of my blueprint, there's a whole specific nutrient needs section. Mm-hmm. We look at all the different vitamins, vitamin A, B, C, D, E. Also, we look at probiotics, omega-3s, antioxidants. So really looking at genes associated with, certain needs that can be taken care of by supplementation, by adjusting your diet, and so on. Other sections of the report, we look at physical fitness, we look at obesity risk, we look at hormonal health, we look at food sensitivities, mental health, mental wellness. So it's quite a comprehensive test. There's quite a lot covered there.
Yeah, and I think a person looking at the report, hopefully is going to get an understanding of just how many different ways of applying to their health. So, Robin, where do you start with a report with your patients and how do you kind of evolve that conversation?
Well, the test is for people who are looking at their lifestyle. They're looking for a quality of life. They're looking to prevent disease, to make really impactful choices in their everyday life, and maybe they're dealing with a disease as well. And so when you look at where to start with people, you have to start with doing an assessment, looking at symptoms, but also looking at objective measurements, looking at understanding some of the things we don't see in people, those underlying biochemical nuances, as well as genetic predispositions. So when you do the test, specifically, I will start with the ground level, start with, diet, start with nutrients, because the nutrients is what is providing all of our biochemical pathways with the ability to actually function properly. So you're not going to get anywhere with disease per se, or kind of moving the barometer, unless someone is nutrient enriched in minerals. And what's interesting is we kind of take for granted that the food that we're eating, we're breaking it down properly, we're absorbing it, and we're getting all of the nutrients as expected, right? And kind of Health Canada has these blanketed kind of recommended daily allowances that are really for the general population, but that doesn't account for individual needs. And what we find with genetics is that we can predict who needs how much of certain vitamins, because they may be at a risk for vitamins. And these may be vitamins that we can't even test for in clinics. So one in particular is choline. And this is my new favorite vitamin, because I find the genetics of this so interesting, and
Tell us more. I'm intrigued.
The chemicals about it. So the body has its own natural process of producing choline. And choline is part of the cellular membrane. It makes phosphatidylcholine.
It's a fat, right?
Yeah, and it's a fat, and it helps with our neurotransmitters, acetylcholine. So it helps with our memory, it helps with our brain, it helps with our muscles. It's also part of bile production, so it helps with bile synthesis as well as our fat absorption, and therefore our vitamin, essential fatty acid, and vitamin absorption too. So it does quite a bit. It also, I won't get on the topic of methylation, but it also is one of the major pools that uses our methyl donors. And so if someone's deficient in choline, it can cause a lot of problems with liver, fatty liver disease, issues with bile, sluggishness, memory issues, kind of a lot of vague symptoms that we see commonly.
A lot of people walking around experiencing those things.
Yeah, and we wouldn't even think about it, and it takes decades for nutrient deficiencies sometimes to pop up. So what you're doing is you're kind of identifying, where these little nuances can happen, and you're providing the body with either the foods that they need in order to get the amount, or with supplementation. And sometimes that supplementation, it doesn't have to be long term, just has to be for a few months, as you're making those assessments with symptoms.
So what you're saying is that using a genetic test like My Blueprint, there's a section on nutrients specifically. It doesn't tell you if you're deficient in that nutrient though, right? It tells you if you have a predisposition to become deficient, right? I think that's a very important point, because a lot of people are like, so am I deficient in iron now after they read the report?
Yeah.
No, that means that you need to be tested and maybe be a little bit more vigilant and on top of it with your healthcare provider to test regularly for iron or something like choline you can't test for, right? So that's something that, may not inform a lab test, but it may inform that you're eating foods that are higher in choline. Like, for example, egg yolks are higher in choline. And there are certain conditions and states in life, like pregnancy, that you're focusing on neurodevelopment in utero, and you need higher levels of these fats, right? Choline's a huge factor of that. So I think that is an important distinction, I think, that a lot of people get confused on, right? Let's talk a little bit of methylation. I know this is a big, scary topic for a lot of people.
Sure.
Maybe you've heard of, anybody listening has heard of methylation before. So let's break down methylation for the person that really has never kind of had it explained to them before. I'll start with you, Aaron, and then we'll bring Robin in.
Sure. Yeah. So as people that study molecular biology, when we think of epigenetics, or when we hear the term epigenetics, which is above genetics, we're thinking about methylation. And really all it means is that we have an enzyme that puts a methylation or a methyl group, a carbon dioxide with a couple of hydrogens, onto a molecule. And by doing that, it changes the shape of the molecule, and then the molecule, can be moves on to the next step of the pathway, which could be degradation or whatever. So we have a number of enzymes, and the My Blueprint test looks at some of these that's involved in that whole methylation process.
Anything that you want to add, Robin?
Yeah, methylation within itself, so it occurs in pretty much every single one of our cells in the body, I believe, other than red blood cells. And what it's doing, maybe it does in red blood cells.
Well, red blood cells are the only cells that don't have
a nucleus.
the nucleus or the genome,
Yeah.
so there's no DNA methylation there, but
there's other methylation.
Yeah.
I understand it as methylation is that it basically is one of the key processes that turns things on. It kind of makes things happen. And so, I mean, it gives that a little bit more context.
Yeah, so it's occurring in pretty much every single one of our cells, and what it's doing is it's producing one of these chemical tags, which is it's providing the body with methyl donors. And the way that we get that is through a vitamin called SAMe. And the reason the body is doing this is because these methyl tags, the SAMe, these methyl donors are being used for hundreds of biochemical pathways. So it's really like one of those stop points, those checkpoints for the body to be able to change and direct the metabolism and the state at which the body is in. So what you'll see is the body will increase SAMe production and methylation when it's in sort of an anabolic, high metabolic state. When it's in more of a detox or trying to recover or high oxidative state, it'll shut down the methylation and it'll go more towards into producing protective molecules for our body, like things like glutathione, which is a very strong antioxidant. It helps with DNA protection. And so methylation, it's used to repair our DNA and RNA. It's used to produce our DNA. It's used to for energy production, for detoxification, for hormones, for mood and neurotransmitters.
Pretty much everything.
So really, it has its hand in everything, and it's kind of this check stop that the body uses.
Okay. Yeah. So it's not necessarily like my next question. You kind of beat me to it was, why should we even care about this methylation? Because I know as clinicians, we hear a lot about methyl this, methyl that. This is a methylated form of a vitamin. If you walk into your health food store, you might look at your B12 bottle and say, oh, this is methylcobalamin. Cobalamin is the actual B12. This is the methylated version. So I think that has a role to play on stimulating methylation, right?
So, and this is why people and companies are starting to gear towards these active forms of these vitamins, because this pathway is reliant on the active forms of the B12 as well as the folate.
That makes sense.
In our genetics, we may not have the highest efficiency at converting that. And so the reason that there's been an explosion of information on methylation is because, as I mentioned, this is one of the foundational pathways. So if this is disrupted, then it's going to have an effect in so many different areas of our health. And what people have really focused on is how the genes are associated with all these diseases. And I would say it's contributing, but it's not necessarily the cause.
Yep.
And so people are wanting to kind of by-step, make sure that their methylation pathways are working properly. And you can see, when someone comes in with widespread issues with methylation, you're going to see issues with any part of the system that has a high cellular turnover, because it's for DNA repair and
so give me some examples, like
gastrointestinal issues. Okay. So you're having trouble, the GI lining repairs very rapidly. So hair, skin, nails as well.
I was thinking hair,
neurotransmitters, detoxification, hormones. So all of these are relying on constant.
That's right, the daily processes.
Yeah, daily processes. And so you'll see, fatigue, generalized gastrointestinal issues, maybe problems with repair. Like skin repair, wounds, or hair not growing, lower metabolic function.
So if somebody has an issue with methylation, which is something that a genetic test will tell you, right? It looks at, how well do you use folic acid, for example. Folic acid is one of the main, methylators. Talk a little bit about, we might have heard about the active forms of vitamins. Talk a little bit about folic acid specifically, because that's something that, people are now even asking for, like pregnant women. I want the active form of folic acid, because that's an area where there's lots of dividing cells, right?
Oh yeah. Well, and that's where, folic acid kind of made its claim to fame, I think, is we all know that fortification and increase in folic acid prevents neural tube defects. Yeah. So issues with babies being born and their nervous system being developed, because there's such a high demand. So folic acid is the synthetic form. Yeah. So the body still has to convert the synthetic form into an active form. The natural form that we find it in is folate, and it comes from the word foliage, right?
Plants,
plants, leafy greens. This is where we get a lot of it, a lot of our sources from. So the body, if we were to be eating active vitamins all the time, there would be no control system, for our body to control what's happening. There needs to be these checks and balances. So the body has these pathways, methylation, to activate these vitamins. So it's very tightly regulated to make sure that your body matches the supply and demand. And so if you have a high amount of folate and the demand is there, then your body's going to convert it into the active form. Now, if there's an increase in the demand and you have a genetic variation, or version that is leading to a deficiency in how quickly you can keep up with that demand. Now you're putting the body at a risk for a deficiency in the active form. And that can put us kind of a stop or a pin in some of these metabolic functions.
So you can easily see how it gets complex pretty quick, where like you're talking about different metabolic pathways. Yeah. You're talking about different forms. There's many different forms of that folic acid conversion gene, MTHFR. Maybe you've heard about it. I wanted to ask you, Aaron, is there a problem of too many active forms or too much methylation? I think you've already kind of touched on it, Robin, there, but I'd like to get your take, Aaron, on overmethylation. Is that a thing?
Well, I'll let Robin talk about the clinical impact of that, but definitely, I mean, one analogy that I like to use when thinking about these types of things is, imagine you have a drain in your sink that's the normal size. You turn the water on full blast. It might fill up a little bit of water, but maybe you want a little bit of water in the bottom of your sink, and the rest will just flow through, right? Now imagine that the drain is a little bit clogged. Imagine like an enzyme isn't working as efficiently as you'd like. So then you'd get too much water in the sink and not enough going through. So it's all about having the right balance. Likewise, if the drain is way too big, water would just flow through and you won't have any accumulation of water.
So it's more about balance. It's not like we tend to think about like either I want things high or I want things low in conventional medicine. Yeah. Where this is more about the body has an intelligence to it, and there's pathways and there's redundancies built in. Yeah. So people that are slow at, let's say, this one pathway, that there's a buildup, there's symptoms associated with that, and they are missing out on the other end with some of the key nutrients. And the body tries to work around, and in some cases it can't, right? So you see this in your practice all the time. So bringing it back to just what maybe listeners might be experiencing, what are some of the things that you find in your practice that when you correct methylation, they have those aha moments with it, like I feel a lot better.
Yeah, so we can kind of just, as I mentioned, these pathways get represented in different systems like neurology or our mood, our hormones, our ability to repair in our gut, in our skin, and just definitely sharpness, memory, kind of that cognitive capacity. A lot of times what I'll see is if there's methylation issues, a lot of times it'll affect detox, and there'll be kind of this overwhelming amount of toxic burden or different chemicals that our body's not necessarily clearing as quickly.
What would be a couple signs of that? Like one that comes to my mind is like walking through a mall and you're walking through the perfume department and you get a massive headache right away, right?
Yep, headaches, brain fog, word recollection,
Yep.
the idea is
Not
there,
as sharp anymore.
and you're just kind of noticing these vague declines in brain function, and people usually chop it up to aging, but I've seen some pretty sharp 90-year-olds, and I don't think we should just accept that as status quo. And so I do find that I won't just dive in with these methylated B12 or folates, because again, this whole system is very eloquently designed to work with these checks and balances. So it's about providing the minerals, providing all of the B vitamins, getting those statuses up, and then if the demand is there and needed, and there's genetic variants, and there's a history of deficiencies or biomarkers that we use to see how well the cells are methylating, then definitely I'll start adding in Bs, or the B12s. But I like using kind of the tri B12, all three versions, because there's different pockets, different areas in our body that these are going to.
Yeah.
So just making sure that we're trying to mimic as much as possible, the natural states that we would find, and help to support the body where needed.
So for those of you listening, there's three main active forms of B12. I think that's what you were just talking about, Robin. Yep. Methylcobalamin, adenosylcobalamin are the two real active end of the pathways, and then there's a kind of a precursor, hydroxycobalamin, and then the kind of even precursor form before that, which is cyanocobalamin. And when you look at most supplements found in pharmacies and health food stores, they will contain the cyanocobalamin form. And if a person has trouble methylating, which we just talked about where that might be the case, there's an increased benefit of using a form that it doesn't need to be converted, because though it's bypassing the enzymes that convert it to the active form. So then it's no longer sluggish. We've kind of gone to the bottom of the drain already, and it's already on the other side.
Right.
So in this particular case, I think it's important to understand that difference. And you can probably apply that to any single B vitamin going down the line. There are forms of it that are more absorbable, and that's something that we're going to be covering a lot more on Supplementing Health on this show, where we're going to talk about that. So stay tuned for other episodes and check back in through some of the descriptions, and we're going to talk all about B vitamins. But for the sake of time, let's keep going and plotting forward on this on genetics specifically. So let's talk a little bit about and shift gears into diet. One of the things that is huge right now is the ketogenic diet. One of the things that is also equally huge is plant-based veganism. How can a genetic report like My Blueprint give a person insight on which diet is better for them? We'll start with you, Aaron.
Sure, yeah. So when you're talking about going plant-based, there are certain nutrients that are found in plants that are not found in, or are found in animals that are not found in plants.
Correct.
The one example which we talked about earlier is with vitamin A. So beta carotene is in plants. If you go into a vegan diet and you can't convert beta carotene into active vitamin A, then maybe you should be supplementing with vitamin A, with active vitamin A.
And you would never know that if you didn't do this report. So that right there in itself is one example of, if you've chosen to eat a certain way, just based on personal preference, ethics, whatever it may be, there may be some consequences on your metabolism that you don't know. And vitamin A is one of those examples.
Yeah, and omega-3 is another example where there are animal and plant sources of omega-3s, and some people can't rely only on the plant sources. So,
but you can get preformed EPA and DHA from algal sources. So those are the active versions.
Exactly.
Of it.
Yeah. So if you're vegan, you want to stay that way, but you need that animal, quote unquote, source of omega-3. Then you can get it from an algal supplement. Yeah.
Okay.
Or active forms, because that's what they really are, is the active.
You just won't get the benefit of getting, linoleic acid from flaxseed, basically.
Exactly,
That's
yeah.
the conversion is slow.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's a really important one. We know how important omega-3s are, right? Anything else that you can think of just based on dietary choice?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the ketogenic diet, so a lot of people, cut out carbs and focus on fats, but there are good fats and bad fats, and sometimes your genetics can sort of point you in the right direction. Avoid the saturated fats, make sure you're getting enough of the omega-3s, and so on.
I find this so fascinating because if we look at the genetics and what it is it's a history of our ancestors and where we came from. And so what was your culture? What was, the tendencies for what you were eating? Were you eating a lot of root vegetables? Were you eating, a lot of whale blubber? Or, where were you relying on a lot of your energy and metabolic resources from? So we know that not everybody comes from the same, if you go far enough back, sure, we come from the same part of the world.
Right, yeah.
But over, the last couple thousand years, humans have really diverged into unique sort of specimens. And this is where we can see some of the genetics is helping us to understand how people are really responding to certain macronutrients, including fats. And so there's really particular genes that are influencing how we are hormonally responding to fats. So typically when we eat fat, there's certain cues, there's hormones that our body uses to tell us that we're satiated,
that we're full.
We're full, we're good. And typically when we eat fat, we should feel full, right? But based on our genes, not everybody is getting that same strength of signal. And so it actually changes how the hormones are getting released. So people are still feeling hungry, even though they're having high calorically dense foods, including saturated fats.
So would that somehow inform whether you should be eating high fats or not? Or does that mean that you need to eat other foods that do make you feel full?
So part of it is a behavioral modification. So that maybe you can't rely on that chemical signaling that you are full. And what I typically see with patients is that they, rather than saying, "Oh, I feel good, I'm going to stop," they're eating until they're engorged. They get that really distension, and they feel almost sick after. And over time, that's going to lead to weight gain. And so a lot of people, they do ketogenic diet to lose weight. So you're kind of, working against yourself there. So it helps to direct behavioral modifications. So relying more on, food size and portions as opposed to those chemical signals. But also the studies show that if you change the amount of saturated fat that people are eating, they'll lose weight. So it does have to do with the macronutrient ratios.
So you meaning if you eat low fat, you'll lose weight?
Low saturated fat, but increase in polyunsaturated fats and monounsaturated fats. So more of these kind of plant-based.
So you could be keto, but you just have to be very specific. You couldn't be eating bacon when you're on keto, for example.
Yeah, you can be eating cheese, you can be eating bacon, you can be eating any of the high-fat,
a lot of the foods that when you're keto, people are like, I love keto because I can eat as much bacon as I want.
Butter.
Butter. That may actually genetically not be good for you, and you may be doing yourself a long-term disservice, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Do you want to add anything, Aaron?
Yeah, a couple of things. So you talked about the strength of the signal in your brain that tells you to stop eating. So it's also the timing of that signal, right? So sometimes just slowing down to give your brain time to accumulate that signal would be important, right? And the other thing is just about genetic testing in general. So when people have their genetic results and they know the basis of an issue that they might be having or a deficiency that they might have, they're much more likely to stick to a program. So I'm sure if you tell a patient, reduce saturated fat in your diet, most people might do that for a month or two and then go back to bad habits. Whereas if you have the genetic information and based on your genetics, you have an increased risk of metabolic disorder if you have saturated fats, then I think they're more likely to be mindful of that.
It's an excellent point. We see that as clinicians all the time, where you tell somebody do something like take vitamin D, and people are like, yeah, I know, I'll take it for a month. But if you show them you are majorly deficient in vitamin D, they are going to take their vitamin D until you tell them, your levels are good, right?
Well, and you equate it with an endpoint too. So we know that if you modify your diet in this way, you're likely, based on your genetics, to respond in a certain way.
Such fascinating information. Just based on what we talked about, you can inform your decisions based on dietary preferences. By knowing your genetics, we can look at nutrients that you may be predisposed to becoming deficient in. So, for example, the My Blueprint report looks at vitamin D. And so it looks at both the vitamin D receptor and the way that you convert it, right, to the active form. And a person that has these particular mutations may need to be even more diligent with their supplementation. And there's so many other examples that we can look at, but just by omega-3s, vitamin D, iron, beta-carotene, some of these foundational things, a person can really get that personalized precision health and either go test more or be a little bit more diligent with what they're doing. We have so much more that we can talk about. Sure. I think I'm going to bring you guys back for part 3 because it's so it's so dense. We haven't talked about things like hormones. We haven't talked about estrogen metabolism, which is huge. I really, really want to talk about gluten and that whole idea and whether you should be gluten-free or not. Yeah. And the testing can actually give you some insight into that. And then I want to talk about detoxification. That one we touched on a little bit in terms of methylation, but there are antioxidants like glutathione that are incredibly important for our detox pathways. And I personally have some issues on my genetic tests in that area, so I want to pick your brains on that. So I'd like to thank you both for sharing your insights again, and thank you for joining me.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening today. For more information about our guests, past shows, and future topics, please visit aor.ca/podcasts. Do you have a topic that you want us to cover? We invite you to engage with us on social media to request a future topic or email us at marketing@aor.ca. We hope you tune in again next week to learn more about supplementing your health.